Hey folks, we're going to get started in just a minute. We want to make sure people have time to log on. We currently have 75 participants. So thank you for joining us. I think we're good. Welcome everybody, good evening. Thank you so much for taking the time to join our webinar about managing polluted runoff in southeastern Pennsylvania. I think it's amazing that we have so many people willing to spend an hour with us in the evening during dinner time to learn about this really important project. So we're thrilled to see you. My name's Julie Slavitt. I'm the Executive Director of the Tacony-Tacony-Frankford Watershed Partnership, or TTF. Our job is to connect the residents of our 30 square mile urban watershed to their creeks. And I'm gonna ask my co-moderator, Sue, to say hello.
Hey, hello everybody, welcome. We're thrilled to have you tonight. My name's Susan Myrov. I'm the Watersheds Program Director for the Pennsylvania Environmental Council. We're thrilled to be co-hosting this event tonight. I primarily work in stormwater management, education, and outreach, and I work out of our Philadelphia office. I also just want to say that I am a volunteer member of the TTF Board of Directors, and I serve on my Environmental Advisory Council in Abington Township. So welcome everyone. So if we're going to our, I guess we're going to go to our next slide. Is that?
Just one quick second, Sue.
Okay.
But thank you, and just everyone, welcome so much. Welcome. We're so happy to have you. And my name is Kristen Zilkowski. I'm the Director of Digital Engagement for Conservation Voters of Pennsylvania. And for those of you who don't know us, Conservation Voters of Pennsylvania is the statewide political voice for the environment. And we elect environmentally responsible candidates to state and local offices. We advocate for strong environmental policies, and we hold our elected officials accountable. And we're also funded to provide training and resources to our environmental partners to build a stronger movement. So just to let everyone know, we're going to be recording this event tonight and we'll share it afterward. So please be sure to keep an eye out for that follow-up email. And if you're not on, definitely move on to slide 2.
So we'd really like to take a minute and thank the amazing co-sponsors who are joining us tonight and really were responsible, I think, for inviting so many of you. Keeping our water clean and addressing pollution takes all of us working together, and we are so grateful to our partners for joining us and for all the work they do every day to protect our watersheds and our water resources. So please take a minute to take a look at all of our great co-sponsors tonight, and thank you so much.
So tonight, we're going to hear from an incredible panel of experts. There they are. And I'm going to do very brief introductions with the idea that we want to sort of get to the meat of things. And these folks are experts, and we'll tell you a little bit about the work that they've done. So first, we'll have Drew Shaw. He's the Environmental Planning Section Chief for the Montgomery County Planning Commission. We have Zach Keegan, who is a senior water resources engineer at the consulting firm AECOM, who specializes in green stormwater infrastructure planning and design, flood mitigation, and wastewater treatment. We also have Adrienne Vicari. She serves as the financial services practice area leader for Herbert, Rowland, and Grubik Incorporated, a design firm providing civil engineering, surveying, and environmental services. And last, but certainly not least, we have Ruth Ein Hawker with the Center for Watershed Protection. She's the director there. So before we get started, we just, as usual, have a few housekeeping items. We've all gotten a lot better at Zoom the last few months, but it is important to remember these things. So we'd like to know who you are. I mean, we want to see people's faces. If you want to, take off your dark screen and let us see you if you're comfortable with that. But please don't feel any pressure. Can also rename yourself, which I think is always really helpful instead of having your phone number. You can rename yourself by clicking on the 3 dots in the upper right-hand corner of your picture and selecting rename. And that's a great way for people to be able to see who else is on. So that's useful information. Because there's so many people joining, right now we have over 100 participants, we ask you to please stay muted so we can minimize the background noise. You'll know you're on mute if the microphone symbol on the lower left corner of your screen has a red slash through it. Questions are welcome. So what we'd like you to do, and I think you all know how to do this, is to type into the chat feature, which you can find if you hover on the bottom of your Zoom window and click on the image that looks like a speech bubble. So we're going to hold questions till the end, but Sue Myroff and I are going to be paying attention to that chat and taking notes and trying to sort of summarize and bring together questions that a lot of people are asking or that we think are really good questions. But we'll hold questions to the end. And at first, what we want to do is would love to know where you're calling in from, what community you're from. So the first thing we're going to ask you to do is put that in the chat. So people can see what other folks from their community or their neighboring communities are in. This is always fun to see.
What's your problem?
So slide 4, we're going to move to that while people are doing this. There we go. Whoa, a lot of people. And we are going to do some poll questions. So we want to take a quick temperature check with a couple of very short polls. These are always fun. The first one is to really find out who's on the call, to tell us about yourself. So, why you're interested, who you are and why are you interested in stormwater? So that's the first question. We sort of want to know where you're coming from. So the fun thing about these polls is that we get to see responses, right? So people can start doing that.
Julie, I'm wondering, can you see the answers as they're coming in?
Nope.
Okay, so waiting on about 10 or 15 more answers, and then I'll end the polling. And I think it comes up when I hit that button.
Okay, I was wondering, other people can, all right. I see the questions, I just don't see the answers. And everyone can see that, correct?
Yeah, that comes through.
So there, this is really interesting. We wanted to sort of see who was on, and it's great that a third of the people on are residents, and they're interested in this from their residential perspective and as taxpayers and constituents. And then we have a fair number of folks who are water resource professionals, and very great to see volunteers, watershed volunteers. And I saw some names. I know, that some of our stream keepers, our water quality monitors who work with our other watershed organizations are on this call as well, because they certainly care about these issues. So I think that was really helpful. I don't know if anyone wants to say anything else about that. And then we'll do the second poll, which is always my favorite question to ask people. Which is what, and if you don't know, that's okay. You'll figure it out tomorrow, but please let us know what watershed you are in. What watershed do you call home? In TTF, when we ask people this, a lot of folks say the creek near the train station. So we know we all have work to do.
We know we couldn't list all of the watersheds in the region, so thank you for putting that in your chat box.
It's a good list. And we're all Delaware River watersheds. That's great. So 20% from the Wissahickon. It's a big watershed. And then it's interesting to see the next one is other and Schuylkill and Darby Cobbs. So I think that's great. You know, as I said, we're all most of us are Delaware River watershed folks. We are happy to have people from the Susquehanna River watershed, however. So what I think we're going to do now is we are just going to pass this on. We're ready to get started. Please ask us questions in the chat. And our first speaker is gonna jump on.
All right, hello everybody. Thank you for tuning in tonight. As you heard, my name is Drew Shaw. I'm the Environmental Planning Section Chief for Montgomery County. And we cover all things environmental, but lately it seems like we're doing the majority of our work in sustainability, resilience, and stormwater management. So I'm very glad to talk to you and kind of set the stage tonight. My presentation is kind of a downer, but the folks that come after me are going to offer some great solutions, so stay with me. And when we talk about stormwater management, some problems are easy. Next. For example, we all experienced this recently, the problem, we identify the problem, there's no toilet paper in the stores. Next. We identify the cause. Some folks are just overcautious and they want to make sure that they've got enough paper at home. That caused a problem. And then next, we identify the solution. Go on to the next slide, please. Stormwater isn't easy, unfortunately. The problems we're experiencing now have taken a long time to develop. If you look back 50 years ago, when a lot of this region was developing, our stormwater regulations, some of them didn't even require stormwater management. The only thing required was to get the water off of the lawns, off of the roads as quickly as possible into the streams. And that's the existing condition we're dealing with. We're trying to deal with problems that have taken decades to develop, and we're not going to solve them overnight. While we're solving these problems, we have to realize that we may cause problems downstream. So we have to be very careful to avoid future problems. When we work upstream in the watershed, we affect the timing of the stormwater as it flows down through the watershed, and we have to avoid causing future problems. So getting the answer can be tricky. Even just maintaining our systems, our stormwater management systems, is expensive. And since a lot of the systems are underground, when budgets get tight, when difficult decisions need to be made, it's kind of easy to say, well, we'll get to the stormwater system next year. And then next year becomes the next year and the next year. And then the next thing you know, we've got some failing infrastructure problems. And in that same vein, money to fix problems is not abundant. So there's some, the expense is an issue, as you'll see in a minute. And the issues go beyond flooding. I mean, the bottom picture there that you see, it's an unfortunate situation. Cars are in the floodwaters, buildings are in the floodwaters, but it goes beyond flooding and gets to the very hydrologic cycle, that water cycle that we all learned about in high school. The top picture is a stream. It's a small headwater stream, and there should be water in it, but there isn't because we're disrupting the water cycle with all of our impervious surface and the disruption to the land. And so we're creating a problem that's even bigger than just stormwater. Next slide, please. So what is the problem? And let's get down to a basic question. What is stormwater? So we're all on the same page. We're talking about rainwater that runs off the land during and just after a storm. And can it be a nuisance? Yes. When flooding occurs, when our basement floods or the backyard is wet and mushy, yes, it can be a nuisance. Can it be a threat? Yes. When roads flood and emergency vehicles can't get through, or people can't get home from their jobs or get to where they're going, it can be a threat. And sometimes people drive through flooded areas and disasters happen. So we can have some real problems relating to stormwater. But it's also important to realize it's a resource. This is the water that recharges groundwater, that keeps our forests alive, that ultimately becomes our drinking water. So it's a resource. So I want to talk a little bit about why stormwater can be a problem, and is the problem getting worse, and the costs involved. And my last slide, I just have a few little resources for you to consider once we're done with the presentations. So next slide, please. Right, these 4 pictures show a transition between the forest. I'm not sure where that red line came from. But this transition between the forest to an urbanized environment. And keep your eye on the horizontal arrow. That's signifying runoff. When rain falls on the land, it can go in 4 different directions. It can evaporate back into the atmosphere or be transpired through leaves of plants back into the atmosphere. It can soak into the shallow soil and be held in the spaces between the soil. Or it can soak deeply into the ground where it recharges groundwater, or it can become runoff. And in the forested situation, you see in the upper left, about 10% of what falls on the land can become runoff. As we move from that forested situation to a rural development, which is really low density, even so, runoff can double. We can have 20% of the rainfall running off the land from the hard surfaces that are represented by rooftops and driveways and roadways and sidewalks and so on. Moving down to the suburban style development that we see so much of in Montgomery County. Now runoff is about 30% of the rainfall. And this, again, is coming from all of the hard surfaces, even the lawns that developers put in. They're compacted, they're smooth. So everybody wants a nice looking lawn in their front yard, but those lawns don't infiltrate a lot of stormwater, and it all runs off and becomes about 30% of the rainfall is runoff. And then moving to an urbanized development, or like in our boroughs or the eastern part of Montgomery County, our older townships, we can have as much as 55%, more than half of the rainfall becoming runoff. And that runoff has to go somewhere. I have, next slide, please. I have an illustration. If you're not good with arrows, this should help. Keep your eye on the little red dot. This is a portion of, I think it's Upper Dublin Township outside of AMBLER Borough. This picture was taken around 1969, 1970s. Next slide, please. Watch, it'll turn to, I hope, it'll turn to our developed landscape that we see, and all of those roadways that appeared, all of those parking lots and rooftops and so on that appeared. They all generate stormwater. They all prevent rainwater from soaking into the ground, and they become runoff. Next slide, please. So the result is periodic flooding. It can be nuisance flooding, like I mentioned, with road floods, roads being closed, or it can be catastrophic. We've had some tragic events in Montgomery County where people have been swept off of roadways or trapped in buildings, and they've died from floodwaters. And so flooding is nothing to be taken lightly. It's a very serious situation. And let me just take a moment and ask you please never to drive into a flooded roadway, because disaster can happen. So we have loss of services, loss of property. People's yards get washed away, buildings get damaged, and the threat of loss of life. Even our emergency response personnel, when somebody gets stranded, you see that lower picture on the right, somebody gets stranded, they're there to help, but they're putting their lives on the line, and it's dangerous. We also see environmental degradation. All of the material on the surface of the land, the automotive fluids that drip from the bottom of people's cars, sediment, road salt, that all gets washed into streams, and that causes environmental degradation. Or even just what we call the flashiness of a stream, where the stream quickly rises during a storm and then decreases down to that trickle you see in the middle of that creek there. That's not a healthy environment for anything. The fish, if there's anything that's living in there, they're stressed. There's no trees to shade the water. There's no vegetation on the banks to hold the banks in place. It's just a degraded environment. Next slide, please. Okay, so the question is it getting worse? I hear people all the time talk to me at work and they say, it just seems like we're getting, worse rainfall events. And they're right. This map came out a few years ago. It shows from 1958 to present, the increase in heavy rainfall events. And that's my lifetime. I was born in 1959. So this is something that I've experienced, everyone's experienced. Look at Pennsylvania, 71% increase in heavy rainfall events during that time period. So it is getting worse, and we are seeing more flooding. It's not just your imagination. Next slide, please. And we all see these events. If you've got a smartphone and you're on some notification device, when a storm comes, your phone's going off every 5 minutes telling you about a flash flood watch or a flash flood warning. We see rainfall amounts on forecasts. Then after the storms, the media shows pictures of destruction, roads being washed away, culverts being undermined. The PEMA, the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency, did a study a couple years ago and found that $125 million in damage was caused to public infrastructure by severe storms. That's not private property, that's public infrastructure. And nearly half of it was not covered by federal disaster aid. So who covered that cost? Well, the local governments, local agencies, but ultimately you and I covered a fair amount of that with our tax money. And that's money that literally is down the drain. I mean, we could avoid that cost with some good solid planning. Next slide, please. More on the cost of stormwater. It's not just the facilities. They have to be inspected. They have to be maintained. Storm drains need maintenance. If they clog up, that'll result in flooding. New facilities need to be installed to correct problems as they come up. And there's several state programs. Probably the one that you've heard of is the MS4 program, the Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System program, where every municipality in Montgomery County, for example, needs a permit from the state to manage their stormwater system. And there's certain things they have to do under that permit, like this map that was created on the left there. You see that was not a small task, and those types of things cost money. They're the day-to-day costs, even when it's not raining out, associated with stormwater. Next slide, please. Now, when I talk about costs, people always say, well, what's a rule of thumb? And I found there's no rule of thumb. You can't say, well, it costs, so many dollars per gallon of stormwater treated or whatever, because everything is different. The situation is different. The physical characteristics are different, and it's very difficult. But I have some cost figures here to give you a general idea of what we're looking at. The EPA has looked at their program, the MS4 program, and they found that developing the program across the country cost municipalities over $600 million nationally. That's an average of $140,000 per municipality. Now, of course, a small borough, like Green Lane Borough or Red Hill, they didn't spend $140,000. But places like Abington Township, Lower Merion Township, they probably spent a lot more. And the annual cost of maintaining their program is approaching $1 billion nationally. And that works out to about $230,000 per municipality. So it's an expensive program just to manage stormwater and meet certain requirements that the state is imposing. Next slide, please. I just wanted to give you an idea of project costs, and some of the folks that are coming after me probably can speak to this better, but I did look at some budgets in Montgomery County, at some municipal budgets that are posted, and I found that the costs for capital improvement programs can run anywhere from $2,500 to $800,000, depending on the size of the municipality. And that could be as much as 20% of the public works budget. So again, it's not an easy, cheap kind of program just to manage stormwater. And to give you an idea of some projects, just a picture, the bottom left is an infiltration basin for a 5-acre commercial site, and that costs about $60,000. And the basin on the right is for a larger residential development, and that can cost up to about $100,000. So if a municipality is looking to correct the problem by quote unquote merely putting in a basin, you can run into the tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars depending on the project. Next slide, please. So now that I've depressed everybody, I'll leave you with a slide that'll guide you to some resources again after the presentation. This is our website, at montcopa.org, where we have some stormwater information you might find interesting, some background information on stormwater and watersheds, and that MS4 program, because Montgomery County is a MS4 permit holder, just like the townships and boroughs in the county. There are some tips, frequently asked questions, things you can do. You see on the bottom right that a really nice homeowner's stormwater handbook that was prepared by Philadelphia Water Department. Some tips, things you can do to manage stormwater on your own site. And lastly, we have a series of events that we hold. We hold something probably every year. We try to hold something every year pertaining to stormwater. So keep your eye on that for future notice of events. Thank you for your attention. I think we're holding questions until after, or maybe there's something in the chat. But right now I'd like to turn it over to Zach Keegan so he can tell us a little bit more.
Thanks, Drew. Yeah, I think the presentation will just continue from there. Thank you, everyone. I'm Zach Keegan. I'm a water resources engineer with the consulting firm AECOM in Philadelphia and Conshohocken. And, you know, I'm glad to have this section of the presentation because it's about what can we do to improve stormwater runoff and reduce the impacts. Drew gave a lot of indications of how influential stormwater can be. And so it seems overwhelming and you might feel, well, what really can be done? So there are a number of things that we're already doing, your municipality is doing, and you can ask questions and find out more about what they're doing. Municipalities, based on the stormwater permit, yearly, they're running pollution prevention programs, and good housekeeping is a term under the permit program. Essentially, this is, if you notice, they collect leaves in your streets and street sweep. They may put certain chemicals and storage of materials under cover so that rain never actually contacts them. These are ways to reduce the source of either pollution in stormwater runoff or clogging of infrastructure and some flooding. So your municipalities have a program and money is being spent on these. There's also other programs that they have to manage. And to be honest, land development is always seen as an increase of stormwater runoff and an increase of problems. But you have to acknowledge the fact that there are programs to reduce the runoff of sediment and washing of soils into our waterways. So your municipality is inspecting construction sites and requiring designs that have erosion and sedimentation control. So they are doing their part to try to reduce erosion and silt into our waterways. And then there's also post-construction stormwater management. You know, Drew mentioned that older developments really don't have any management of stormwater. And so if a site is redeveloped and there's not a huge increase in impervious cover, the runoff from the site is actually in somewhat of an improved condition. It's slower, it may be treated more through stormwater management where it wasn't before. But that a lot of times these are out of our control. We might not want a lot of development. We might not have control over the construction conditions. So a lot of residents, when there's quite a few residents on the call, you know, retrofitting, you know, you may convince your municipality or you yourself might retrofit solely for the purpose of stormwater management. You know, this is not based on land development. This is to improve the water quality and reduce flooding in your neighborhood. So stormwater retrofits, commonly the term that is promoted for stormwater retrofits is green infrastructure. You know, what I'd like to do is just present a few types of green infrastructure that either at the municipal level or the residential level are feasible to do. And to be honest, I have a great time building them and designing them for work. So in these images, just on the slide, you know, like I mentioned, street sweeping and reducing some of your fertilizer use. These are controls where we reduce the pollution in the runoff. ENS control, erosion sedimentation control, and or land development does impact stormwater, but not always in a negative way. Next slide. So I mentioned green infrastructure. So what is green infrastructure? It's for some a new term. For others, they've heard it before. If you've heard of stormwater best management practices or low impact development, these are really common terms and they overlap quite a bit. Green infrastructure is intended to be a stormwater management practice or control practice that uses or mimics natural processes. So if it's constructed of natural materials and follows the natural cycles, or if at least if it mimics those cycles, it's considered green infrastructure. So you can see in the image here, we have both cases. This is a rain garden to the right and a downspout connected to a rain barrel, which isn't a natural item, but it mimics some of the natural hydrologic or rainwater cycle. These things capture and they slow the rainwater. They filter, and in anything through soil, they'll infiltrate, and the plants will take up some of the water and transpire or reduce the amount of runoff. And in green infrastructure, it tends to get used as a term when there's more than just the stormwater management as a goal. There is water quality protection. There is in urban environments, there's tree canopy and shading as a benefit. You might improve a streetscape in addition to managing stormwater runoff, create some habitat for local wildlife. And a lot of these are used for community amenities, either in parks or in educational settings. So green infrastructure is used typically as a description of something that has more benefits in addition to stormwater management. Next slide. So the question is, how do you design these, or what's the approach for green infrastructure and stormwater management overall? What we're trying to do for water quality is to manage the storms that happen more frequently and to manage the portion of a large storm that washes off most of the pollution. Some of the details of the amount of rainfall, there's some difference in opinions or in certain areas of the country. But in general, on the right, you see that if you took all the storms in a year and you stacked them from smallest rainfall of a tenth of an inch all the way up to the biggest rainfalls that cause flooding, what we don't want to do is try to size for the really extreme events. Those are something that maybe your municipality or state or FEMA federal agency is going to deal with some major flooding and extreme events. But to really improve water quality and do our part, we're typically down to around an inch of rainfall. A 1-inch storm or slightly larger is 90% of the rainfalls you'll see in your year. And that's really where most of the pollution is coming from. And even slightly larger storms, that's mostly where erosion and your streams are being impacted for these slightly larger storms. So we're not really talking 10-inch rainfalls or those real extreme events. Usually we want to target for green infrastructure these smaller events. And then there's just a quick, a couple of graphics. I like more graphics than text. In these natural processes, it's either the plants uptaking some of the nutrients that run off or the soils themselves. There's a lot of biology in soils, and the chemistry of the soil itself can stabilize and absorb pollutants that we put into our rainwater. And so there's a lot of function, even though it appears as a very simple natural environment. Next slide. So this is some local examples. At the top right, I would say that green infrastructure, if you have a conversation about flood risk and flooding, green infrastructure in aggregate over a large number of systems and a larger program within a community can really have an impact on flooding. But overall, like I mentioned, it's an inch of rain or an inch and a half of rain is the target for your local water quality practice. And that's not necessarily going to fix your flooding problems. This one is near and dear to my heart. It's in front of my house at a local Wawa. The person in the car there was trying to leave the parking lot because they had to get their Wawa coffee. But this was in 2018 in Radnor Township. And there's quite a few flooding issues in Radnor Township. And we've started a stormwater, there is a stormwater fee collected by the township, and there are some projects that are going in for flooding and or water quality improvement. The other thing is that green infrastructure isn't necessarily lawns, like Drew mentioned. Lawns run off quite a bit, and it's likely you've either put pesticides or fertilizers to make the lawns look great. So they don't necessarily, they may contribute more pollutants to the runoff than you really have a benefit to stormwater with lawns. So lawns are good, but it's not necessarily your target approach for water quality improvement. And then ecosystem restoration is another great topic, but it's not necessarily tied directly to green infrastructure and stormwater quality. But they are definitely, this site is in Philadelphia, and there's a lot of great work to restore our waterways themselves. Next slide. So let's just get some examples. If we're going to say, what can we do? Let's have something tangible. So on the right, you'll see my two sons helping me build a rain garden. I decided if I was going to design rain gardens, I'm going to have to do one of my own so I can show my clients. I did most of the digging, I will admit, but they started. So a rain garden is something that you can do on a residential scale or a municipal scale. I design quite a lot of large rain gardens in Philadelphia, but I also, like I mentioned, this is one at my house, and it manages about 3/4 of my roof area, and it does quite a great job. And the image there is early on when it was planted, but now it is a very large and seasonally blooming feature in our yard. So for those who aren't as much into the calculations and details, I try to make it simple here. For an inch or an inch and a half of runoff, you want to take a roof area from a downspout that you're diverting and divide it by 6. If you have that in feet, you multiply the area of roof in feet, you get square feet, divide by 6. That'll essentially get you 6 inches of runoff into your stormwater practice. And that's a pretty good target for you to manage. So it concentrates from roof area down, it concentrates by 6 times. So what you'll design, the way these were designed is to have 6 to 12 inches of ponding in the depressed area of the service. And if you go to your local township, your township may have returned the leaves that they swept up in the street as free compost. And you can amend the soil that you currently have because it might not absorb rain all that well. You want to mix it up and make it much less compacted. You see there in the middle of the photos, it's just amending soil with sand and some free from the township compost. When you plant these, you'll see to the top right, it's just an example of how you don't necessarily have to have the downspout and the rain garden next to your house. You can run a pretty inexpensive flexible pipe to the rain garden area, and it pops up. The water will pop up where needed. And so these really are simple. Now, the other thing that I always like to remind people is that there are big rainfalls. So if you're going to have a large rainfall, you want to have an area where it is going to flow eventually. If you have large rains, you don't want to expect the entire storm to stop and be stored in your rain garden. So in my case, in the back, there's a sort of a spillway that it goes to, and it doesn't cause problems for anyone else. So this is just one type of one example. And then next slide. This is just a larger example of the same thing. So I don't have to go through the details, but this is in Philadelphia on a municipal level. You would say this is a public park, and there's signage in most cases for people to learn. You can take your elementary school kids there and learn some science and even just enjoy the green space that's created. So these can be done on a really large scale. They're not a small practice by nature. Next slide. Rain barrels are another really common one, and I'll try to speed up because I want to give our other speakers some time. But rain barrels are great. The only thing you have to keep in mind is the size of the rain barrel. If you have a roof that's maybe 10 feet by 9 feet, that's an inch of runoff from a roof that would fill a 55-gallon drum. A lot of people think that they can hook up a rain barrel to a really large roof and accomplish the goal, but it's likely just to fill up with a very small rainfall. And so you may want a larger one. You may have a series of rain barrels, or one for each downspout. The key here is the common concerns is mosquitoes, things like that. If you have a screen top, a lot of these have screen tops, mosquitoes won't breed and cause an issue. you do have to have a way of draining it, and you have to consider what happens in the winter when you're not using the water from a rain barrel. You don't want it necessarily to freeze and break the rain barrel. If you don't have necessarily a use for a rain barrel, or you have a roof area that's too large, you might consider on the right is a flow through planter. So it doesn't necessarily store all the rainfall, but it filters it through soil that's inside a lined area inside this container. And then you get to fill it full of plants. It's beautiful and functional at the same time. And it has an overflow and an under drain. So it continues to either passes high storms or it drains down and it's ready for the next one. Okay, next slide. So this is an example of one of the projects my team got to work on, and it was a really great accomplishment. Stormwater alone, if you look on the left, it's a really odd intersection. So you may have these strange intersections in your own town. Kind of dangerous, unclear where the cars should go, and there's some long pedestrian crossings. On the bottom left was the solution. This is constructed. It's a bump out of a curb and a large rain garden. The center is the before and after, and you can imagine the person whose house is adjacent to this. There's a much nicer view and amenity for their front yard. And you can see to the right, it was really hailed as a community benefit because there's a school, an elementary school locally. There was a lot of concern over the street crossings and the uncertain traffic. So it has this community benefit in addition to stormwater. Next slide. Villanova's pictured to the right. I imagine we have some Villanova representation on this call. So I give them credit for that. They've tested out and developed quite a lot of stormwater solutions. This is, if you have a surface area that you just can't give up in terms of using it, your driveway or your patio, there's a lot of solutions that are open graded pavements, either an asphalt or pavers that have spaces between them. And the water soaks up just like it would in a soil. And if you can infiltrate, that's great. It goes down into the soil and filters just as well. If not, you have an under drain, and it would be slower than it would run off of your normal paving. So it's a great solution if you need to use the space. Next slide. So tips overall, you know, hopefully this will be recorded and maybe we'll have some of this available to you later. You know, I just want to make sure that you have fun when you're doing this. This isn't supposed to be complicated, right? Even at a township level, you should have fun. You should create a space that works for you, accomplishes the goal. For design considerations, just make sure that you have these stable entrance and exit, because bigger storms will happen and you don't want to create a problem by trying to build a solution. Select the plants, the type, and the blooms and the seasonal variety that's appropriate for rain gardens. You want to plan for winter, make sure you have under drains if there are any draining issues, and provide a space and a means for maintenance. These aren't maintenance free, just like any garden. You have to get to it and you have to be able to maintain it without damaging it. So there's some planning involved. Overall, I would say if you're looking for more information, think of the kind of stormwater practice and Google that or search that and brochure. And there's a lot of community entities that are trying to educate you on how to do this at your home. So it's easy to find. And if you need any more help, please, I think you'll have my contact info. I'd be happy to help. So I think now we're moving on to speak about funding options. Adrian, I think, yeah, this is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. Good evening, everyone. I'm excited for this opportunity to discuss funding solutions to meet stormwater challenges in a cost-effective way for communities. My name is Adrienne Picari. I'm a licensed engineer with HRG, and I lead our company's financial services division. So my role is to help communities throughout Pennsylvania find more sustainable solutions for financing infrastructure, improve economic development, and help create more inclusive and equitable spaces for people to live, work, and play. And I'm finding that stormwater infrastructure is more and more becoming a vital component of that. So a good chunk of my time the last few years has been establishing stormwater utilities across Pennsylvania and helping groups of municipalities come together to manage stormwater and then pass that savings back to property owners. Stormwater infrastructure isn't something new. We've been dealing with managing stormwater for decades. So how has it been funded in the past? Next slide, please. Well, in many cases, stormwater infrastructure was constructed by developers, and then as they built subdivisions, and then it was dedicated over to the municipality to operate and maintain. So municipalities didn't need to pay to install the infrastructure initially. We saw a lot of development occur in the 70s and 80s. Drew showed us that with one of his slides. And during that time, that's when corrugated metal pipe was usually installed. That has an average lifespan of about 30 to 40 years. So fast forward to today, and most of it is in need of replacement. Municipalities didn't need to fund the initial installation of the pipe, but now they need to fund replacement. So they need to spend more money than before just to keep the infrastructure that they already have. So where would a municipality traditionally look to fund infrastructure? Well, typically they've looked to the state and federal government for grants or for loans with subsidized interest rates. And if you go back to the last slide, you can see on that slide that there's a chart from the Environmental Finance Center, and it's based on information from the Congressional Budget Office. The one with the red line and the blue line on it would be the second slide. Here we go. So the blue line shows that over time, municipalities, counties, and state governments have continued to need to spend more and more on sewer and water infrastructure. The y-axis shows the year, the x-axis shows the year, and the y-axis shows billions of 2014 dollars. So the red line shows us federal aid given in support of sewer and water projects. You can see that the spending has risen by about 320%, while federal grants have pretty much flatlined. So while the regulatory burden has increased in recent decades and infrastructure has gotten to the point that it needs to be replaced, federal subsidies to lessen that burden have declined. So the two methods of stormwater financing on this slide are becoming less and less viable. So what other options are out there? Next slide, please. Municipal tax revenue is another historic way that stormwater infrastructure has been funded. Unfortunately, general fund revenue for many cities, boroughs, and other municipalities is down. In a lot of cases, it hasn't recovered from the 2008 recession. And this chart reflects that information. It's from the National League of Cities. It shows recessions, which occurred in 1990, 2001, and 2007, and then the current COVID recession. Along the x-axis is the number of years since the start of the recession, and the y-axis is the percent of total general fund revenue as compared to the year directly preceding each recession. In 1990, it took municipalities a little over 4 years to recover and get revenue back to pre-recession levels. In 2001, it was closer to 5.5 years before it recovered. But relative to the 2007 recession, in 2019, average revenues stood at 98% of what they were in 2006. So in a lot of municipalities, general fund revenues never fully recovered from the 2008 recession. With COVID in 2020, revenue levels were at about 83% of what they were in 2006. In 2021, they are anticipated to average about 93% what they were in 2006 for most municipalities. Since 2006, the average cost of inflation for infrastructure has risen 58%. This means a stormwater project that cost $1 million in 2006 now costs about $1.6 million. Yet the average municipality collects less tax revenue to maintain infrastructure than they did before. The result is a lot of deferred maintenance. Drew mentioned that earlier in the presentation, and that includes stormwater infrastructure. In fact, the American Society of Civil Engineers graded Pennsylvania's stormwater infrastructure a D in 2018. Why? Because of the growing amount of deferred maintenance and the growing need for capital improvement projects. So where do we go from here? Next slide. Well, municipalities throughout the United States have turned to stormwater utilities. They're a mechanism for meeting the funding gap, and they're a growing trend, especially now in Pennsylvania. Western Kentucky University periodically surveys stormwater utilities, and they're estimating that there's over 1,800 in the United States. They've continued to grow over the past 5 decades due to increased regulation and significant precipitation events, especially those causing flooding. Pennsylvania was a little late getting to the party. We didn't have enabling legislation until 2013, which gave municipalities the ability to transfer stormwater program management activities to a municipal authority and for the authority to charge a stormwater fee. In recent years, I've worked to implement stormwater utilities benefiting over 50 municipalities in Pennsylvania, and year after year, the number of stormwater utilities in Pennsylvania seems to double, even last year during COVID. Next slide, please. So how does a stormwater utility work? Well, the long-term needs of a municipality are evaluated. That includes stormwater problems like flooding, the need to replace aging infrastructure, regulatory requirements, polluted streams, and the desire for green infrastructure. The priorities of the community are considered. These are things like public safety, improving water quality, protecting property values, and the like. And then that's used to consider the long-term cost of stormwater management for the community and how to meet those goals in a low-cost yet effective way. Those costs are then allocated to all developed properties in the municipality in the form of a stormwater fee. In Pennsylvania, the average residential property owner typically pays between $5 to $10 a month if they're paying a stormwater fee. If you don't have a stormwater fee in your municipality, then you're paying through taxes. And you're actually paying a lot more for stormwater management if you're a resident and you're paying it through taxes. In fact, the average residential property owner saves between 40 to 70% to pay for stormwater through a fee in place of taxes. When property owners pay for stormwater through taxes, they can't lower their tax bill. It is what it is. It's based on millage and assessed property value. But if a property owner pays through a fee, they can lower the bill if they wish. They can manage stormwater on their property. They can install green infrastructure like Zach showed us. And if they do, they typically receive a credit, which lowers their stormwater bill. And this inspires community-wide collaboration to manage stormwater and keep costs low over the long term. The money from the fee is used to overcome deferred maintenance, reduce flooding, improve water quality, meet regulations, install green infrastructure, and the like. We find that stormwater challenges are more equitably met at a lower cost for most property owners, and they see more meaningful results. We'll talk about a couple of these bullet points through the course of the presentation today. Next slide, please. So there's various benefits of forming a stormwater utility. I'm going to highlight just a couple today. One benefit is that stormwater utilities provide a dedicated revenue stream for stormwater improvements. We find that as infrastructure continues to age, the need for capital improvements and revenue requirements increase, the municipality's ability to invest in improvements declines over time as tax revenue remains relatively static and cost of improvements rise with inflation and regulatory requirements increase. So relying on general tax revenue for stormwater improvements, it isn't practical for most communities. The stormwater utilities overcome this challenge. They provide a dedicated revenue source that's not used for other municipal funding needs like public safety, streets, or parks. It goes directly to stormwater management. And this is extremely important now during times like COVID. Municipal tax revenue is anticipated to be reduced by 15% on average for most municipalities in 2021 and not fully recover until mid-2022. Next slide. Another financial reason is that stormwater fees are more equitable than a property tax. That's because rates are based upon a property's impervious area. Impervious area are surfaces where stormwater can't infiltrate. Instead, it runs off. So it includes things like building footprints, asphalt, concrete, and the like. And studies show impervious area is the best correlation to the quantity of stormwater runoff or the quality of runoff generated on a property. Much better correlation than assessed property value. You know, it's possible to have a skyscraper and a parking lot with vastly different assessed property values that the same impervious area footprint. So they generate the same amount of stormwater runoff, but paying through taxes would be inequitable. One would pay much more than the other. Another way in which stormwater fees are more equitable than property tax is that all property owners with developed land pay for stormwater, even tax-exempt properties. If you think about tax-exempt properties in a community, it would be schools, universities, hospitals, churches. If we think about those types of properties, we think about large buildings and large parking lots. So typically they're generating a lot of stormwater, but they're not paying for it since they're tax exempt. So with a stormwater fee, for-profit businesses and residents don't have to shoulder the cost burden of stormwater alone. These two reasons result in a significant cost savings to residential users. As I stated on the previous slide, we did a survey of the 50 municipalities where we've implemented stormwater fees, and the average residential property owner saves 40 to 70% by paying a fee instead of paying for stormwater through taxes. Next slide, please. So how can a stormwater utility really benefit the community? What can a stormwater fee be used to fund? Well, for starters, each of the items on the slide, green infrastructure projects, flood reduction, pavement management, improvements which result in better quality of water in lakes and rivers, maintenance of stormwater infrastructure. Each of these things have the added benefit of improving the community, bolstering economic development, increasing property values, and ensuring that where you live, work, and play continues to thrive for years to come. Next slide, please. So thanks so much for letting me join in the discussion tonight. My contact information is shown on the screen if there's any questions that we don't have time to address today. And there's also a link to additional information on stormwater utilities. Now I'm excited to turn the presentation over to Ruth. She's going to provide a case study showing how all the information that we've all spoken about today ties together in implementable solutions.
Thanks, Adrienne. I appreciate it. Since I am going last, I will try to just touch on the highlights to make the most use and most optimal use of the time that we have left. So my name is Ruth Hawker. I am the Pennsylvania State Director for the Center for Watershed Protection. Prior to coming on board with the center, I was the City of Lancaster's Stormwater Program Manager, and I oversaw the building of a green infrastructure program from the ground up that was funded by a stormwater utility. So even though my title is Institutionalizing GSI, a Municipal Case Study, I really hope you take away from this my alternative title, which is Teamwork Makes the Dream Work. Next slide, please. So just to put it into context, for those of you who aren't familiar with Lancaster, Pennsylvania, it's really, really close, within maybe an hour of many of you, maybe a little hour and a half. And it's relatively small. It's about 7¼ square miles. There's about 60,000 residents, and about 50% of the city is actually covered with impervious surfaces. So when it rains, it really drains in Lancaster City. So we've had to deal with all of those challenges, similar to those that you face when it rains in your area in Lancaster City. But what we did was we tried to shift the mindset around that by going through a couple of different things: planning for success, designing for cost effectiveness, function, and maintenance, and then really engaging the public and partnerships, because again, teamwork makes the dream work. Next slide, please. So the first thing that we took a look at when we started thinking about how we could collaboratively address stormwater management in an integrated fashion in the city was we took a look at our goals. So if you're a municipal official or a planner or a county official or even a resident, you know that municipalities really like to plan. And planning is good. When you plan for success, you obviously want to follow through with that. So we had a number of plans on hand already, and we took a look at those and really came up with the idea of developing a comprehensive green infrastructure plan with the goals of being sustainable, and that would include financial sustainability, which led to us in implementing a utility and a stormwater fee, incorporation of green stormwater infrastructure into our plans, ordinances, and codes, as well as integration with all of our construction and reconstruction projects, including some of those capital improvement projects that others have mentioned previously. And one thing that I would like to mention that hasn't really been mentioned yet is our urban forestry plan. Urban forests can provide additional stormwater management as well as additional co-benefits to the municipalities where they are implemented. And they can also be credited towards stormwater management obligations as well. Next slide. So once we had our plans finished and we started thinking about how we might implement them, we started to think about how we wanted to perform our design. So in Lancaster City, there were a number of different factors that would go into what might push a design towards bid and construction. Generally, these were the four criteria that we looked at in terms of most cost-effective design and implementation of green infrastructure. So we looked at projects where we needed to improve pavement condition or reconstruct a street slope, where we had localized flooding issues, where we had really poor pavement conditions, where we needed to address ADA access, or where we had obligations for a permit of one type or another, whether it was an MS4 or another water quality permit. And by looking at those comprehensively with our capital improvement plan, which was funded again with tax funds, we were able to leverage some of that and come up with the lowest overall costs for implementing GSI in streets specifically, which is where a lot of our runoff was generated. Next slide, please. Much like the intersection that Zachary shared with you earlier, we also, the city of Lancaster also took a look at designing their projects for function. In the bottom left, you can see there's a tractor trailer making a turn into a very large impervious surface, which in the photo to the right now looks like a slice of watermelon, if you will, and functions as a porous paver area, beer garden, and also has some rain gardens or curb bump outs associated with it. By eliminating that large swath of impervious area, the city was able to, again, create a safer pedestrian passage for folks who might be visiting the business that sits behind that watermelon slice, which is also a brewery. But also improved traffic flow and saw reductions of traffic speeds in that area of about 5 miles per hour. So again, there were multiple benefits to this as well as managing stormwater. Next slide, please. In addition to planning for or designing for cost effectiveness and designing for function, we wanted to make sure that, or the city wanted to make sure that they were also planning for maintenance. In the lower left on the photos, you can see a previous iteration of the city's rain gardens or bioretention areas and a curb bump out. The thought behind this was that the engineers were anticipating that the small stones there would slow the stormwater down and help keep the plants and the soil in place. Unfortunately, what happened over time is that it would clog with some of the sediment that was coming in off of the roadway, and it became virtually impossible to maintain. So the city, again, took another look at how they were doing things and incorporated policies to incorporate sediment forebays, as you see in the pictures in the center and on the upper right, that were designed out of concrete with a flat bottom, specifically so that their maintenance crews could go in with a flat-edged shovel. And it was also helpful for them to identify buildup because it was more visible than it was when it was cemented in between those cobbles. Next slide, please. I think we've all mentioned this earlier, or all of the speakers have mentioned this earlier. Incorporating and installing green stormwater infrastructure is not a one-off thing. It's not a once and done. You have to continue with inspection and maintenance. A lot of these are pretty common. You'll see these in a lot of ordinances and a lot of best practice manuals. Things like bi-weekly vacuum sweeping of porous pavement surfaces, weeding of rain gardens, replanting dead vegetation, regular trash removal, inlet and structure cleaning, and then occasionally you'll get some of those non-routine maintenance practices like you see in the lower right here, which involve a tow truck bringing a car out of a curb bump out. Not something that happens on a regular basis, but they wanted to make sure, it's something to think about and make sure that you have a policy in place to think about that. Next slide, please. That would also fall under that, good housekeeping procedures that was mentioned earlier. Making sure the staff know how to clean up if there were potentially a fuel spill. Finally, before I close, one of the things that Lancaster City could not have done any of this without is public engagement and partnerships. So again, at every opportunity, we had to have public support for everything that we were doing. We did a lot of outreach and engagement with the public before we instituted the utility and the stormwater fee. We offered workshops to contractors when we began updating our ordinances and regulations. We incorporated public art so that we had some visual aspects to bring attention to stormwater practices that were being incorporated as part of capital improvement projects. We engaged the public in an adopted BMP program so that we could save some of our maintenance costs and get extra eyes on the ground, if you will, to make sure that our practices, when they needed to be maintained, were maintained. And we also partnered with local organizations, conservancies, and watershed groups to really help promote the program and emphasize the success that we were having. In this case, again, as I'll close, next slide, please. I can't stress it enough. Teamwork makes the dream work. Residents, elected officials, planners, engineers, volunteer organizations, and watershed associations and other organizations like the TTF partnership are vital to making things work in a municipal structure. So with that, I will say thank you. I apologize for running over time, and I will turn it back to Julie and Sue to facilitate some questions and answers.
Wow, lots of great information.
Lots of information. So just to check in with everyone who's organizing this, I think what we've decided is we'll take like 10 minutes of questions, 8 to 10 minutes of questions, and we'll let folks off at 7:15. The chat has been really great. People are asking a bunch of questions. We will respond to those. I know in the follow-up, we'll try to send out resources and everything for people. I think one question that we wanted to address, which I think is a really good and interesting question, and I think that all the panelists, and maybe we start with Drew, because I think he would have a good perspective on this, is how do communities manage stormwater when their different watershed boundaries are different than municipal boundaries? What are the ways that municipalities can do that?
Well, it's funny. There was a question in the chat about that, and there was an answer probably about 10 years ago that we could do some stormwater management planning on a watershed basis, and consider how water moves through the watershed and down the watershed and address problems. Unfortunately, as you heard, funding is an issue, and funding is rather tight. In the meantime, there are some examples of cooperation between municipalities that I found very encouraging. And if a municipality is half in one watershed and in another, that means probably the adjacent municipality is in the same boat. And where they share a watershed, they can plan together to do some stormwater management planning to solve issues, because frequently the issues run along the watershed boundary and not so much the municipal boundary. All it takes is some coordination and some cooperation. There are some great agencies out there, government agencies and private organizations that will help plan events. You heard Zach talking at AECOM. They do some great work. You get a consultant involved, study your issue, and work cooperatively to solve the problem. It may cost less than if you were trying to address the problem alone. So cooperation often brings about a scale that saves you money.
And Drew, just to add on to that, I think people would be surprised how often your municipality has a group of people who volunteer to be a stormwater advisory committee or stormwater group, and they speak to each other in different, because we're kind of stormwater geeks, so we like talking about these things. We see projects and we ask questions. So I'd say if anyone's interested, find out if you have one and go to the meetings and have discussions. This is something we have to solve as a community. It's not going to happen.
That's a good point, Zach. And if they don't specifically have a stormwater committee, they probably have a local environmental advisory committee, and get on your EAC and you can start working on some of these issues.
Yeah. It's been exciting to see all the momentum that's been building up in recent years relative to municipalities coming together to manage stormwater. So, we have instances where it's 2 municipalities coming together to work on solutions. We have instances where we've pulled together 32 municipalities to work together in Pennsylvania on regional stormwater management. And we even have instances now where we have counties stepping forward and basically developing stormwater management programs that municipalities can opt into, and the counties are helping. And then along with that, the thought of a stormwater utility, Zach mentioned having collaboration throughout the community. And we've really, seen that when there's a stormwater utility, it really incentivizes property owners to get involved. We see large-scale developers stepping forward and wanting to build that green infrastructure for the communities, and doing it because then they receive a discount off of their stormwater fee. So basically, savings are seen when people start collaborating, and then those savings are shared throughout the community. So it's pretty exciting.
Thank you. And the TTF Watershed Partnership is a partnership that was created by its municipalities. So we are always happy to talk about, how we do this work and how we work across municipalities to get things done. In addition, the Wissahickon is an example of a watershed with a bunch of municipalities that are working towards this. So maybe that's a topic for a future webinar. Sure. One of the things that, people asked a few other questions, and I think we want to try to answer a couple of them because I think we have some resources on the call too. So people at the beginning on the chat were really interested in hearing about salt. I don't know if any of the panelists can talk about that in terms of the problem with salt in our creeks and from our roads, how we deal with that, and what kind of programs are out there to sort of monitor and improve that. So I don't know if one of the panelists want to discuss that. If anybody?
I can talk a little bit about that. Chlorides are a bit of a tricky subject, and things like salt application have been a concern because they tend to lower the pH in streams, which obviously causes some challenges for aquatic life. In terms of addressing it, there's a number of different initiatives across the country that are looking at ways to monitor salt application so that we can get the recipe just right. So instead of just sending out trucks and telling them to salt the living daylights out of a road to make it safe, they're using a more strategic application method. There are also different chloride compounds that can be used that function differently depending on what the minimum temperatures are. And those also have different impacts on local water quality. And finally, there's some investigation on alternatives to using chlorides. The city of Lancaster actually piloted using beet heat, which is a beet juice-based de-icing agent on some of their porous and permeable paver applications to see how well that worked. And it worked pretty successfully in low traffic areas. So I would say another one to Google or to ask your local representatives, maybe municipal engineers about, or even maybe the folks on the call from Villanova and other academic resources in the Southeast region. They'll be able to give you some more specifics.
That's great, thank you. And we also, I know Kevin Roth is on this call from the Penny Pack, and he's our winter salt watch expert, but I think that what we need to do, I'm really trying to be conscious of time, right, Kristen? So I think that we will get back to folks and try to answer some questions with some resources and think about an additional webinar. Is there anything else that we need to say? I know we also wanted to give Alex Cupo a chance to say hi to folks. Is it time to do that?
That'd be great.
Okay, take it away, Alex.
Thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. So I just want to introduce myself. I'm Alex Cupo. I'm the GSI Partners Manager for the Sustainable Business Network of Greater Philadelphia. Thank you to you all for giving me the opportunity to type up my organization. I promise to take up 30 seconds. We serve businesses that focus on people, planet, and profit equally, and we know that that's not always easy. So we offer programming, support, and networking so that members can work with and learn from like-minded business owners, industry experts, and policymakers to help lift our local economy in a positive way. Our industry partnership, GSI Partners, is a great way for companies and organizations that do the work that we've heard about today to stay informed about policies and professional opportunities, as well as gain access to informative presentations, meetings, and exciting events. So if you'd like to learn more, you can find us at sbnphiladelphia.org. So sbnphiladelphia.org. And you can find out so much more information there. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk.
You're welcome. And it was great because I know we had some SBN members that are on this call, and we are certainly an SBN member. It's been great for us. Kristen, do you want to say thank you?
Absolutely. Thank you everyone so much. We really are just, so happy to have you join us tonight on this really important conversation. I hope you all learned a lot. We'll be following up and really, keep the conversation going. If there's, questions you have that did not get answered or follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. And we'll make sure. Thanks, Alex, for dropping the link in there to get you the answers you need. And, we look forward to talking more with you. So thank you so much and have a great rest of your evening.
Awesome panelists.
Thank you.
Yeah, great job.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Panelists.
Yes.